For this video, we're going to be taking a look at the different schools of economic thought that are going to be covered on the AP exam. So we start out with classical macroeconomics. And the basic idea of classical is that the business cycle is always going to adjust for itself. So don't intervene, don't touch it, you're just going to make things worse. And this is that self-correcting economy that we've talked about, the idea that in inflationary gaps, wages and input prices rise, therefore shifting SRAS to the left, taking you back to your long-run equilibrium. Or if you're in a recession, wages fall and input prices fall, shifting SRAS to the right, taking you back to long-run equilibrium. That's classical economics. When Keynes comes in, he basically takes a look at responses to the Great Depression and says, you're not doing enough. We need to come in and we need to fix things. So he says, listen, short-run shifts of the aggregate demand do affect the aggregate output and the price level because there's an SRAS. You can't just look at the long run. You have to look at the SRAS. And the idea that you might get trapped there for a long time. And this isn't just about rational people. We're not sitting there around thinking our own rational ways to do this. There are crises that are created by animal spirits. So this is business confidence, and this is the main cause of business cycles. So we need to focus on that issue. And when you have a negative business cycle, when you're trapped in a recession, that creates a sort of endless loop of negativity. So you need somebody to step in and fill the gap. And that, he says, should be the government. So in the classical theory, you can almost imagine they only have a long run. So a shift in aggregate demand will almost immediately correct back to long run equilibrium. So don't change anything because you're just going to cause inflation. In the Keynesian theory, we now say that there's a horizontal or downward sloping part to the aggregate supply curve. So if there's a horizontal curve, when the aggregate demand shifted left, we are not looking at a self-correcting economy, and the business cycle is now too bumpy, and you have to have government policy to fix it. So there's some challenges to this because this reigns for a while. The first main challenger is monetary policy and monetarism. Keynes didn't really think that monetary policy needed to be that used that often. He thought interest rates should be low, and he thought the central banks should mostly stay out of things. But a lot of people started looking at the Fed's action after the initial stock market crash and say that the Fed contracting the money supply actually caused the Great Depression. And most economists think that this actually occurred. If it wasn't for the Fed's policies trying to maintain price levels, it really would have not been as bad. The monetarists essentially say that you need to have the economy be managed by monetary policy instead of just focusing on just maintaining price level. They say that monetary policy is important. It's less political. You're not worried about taxation. You're not worried about government spending. The people who run it aren't meant to be really involved in the political process. So they're isolated from that, and they're just focusing on managing the economy. So when we look at this a little bit deeper, the monetarists say essentially you grow GDP steadily if your money supply grows steadily. So you set a growth target and you maintain that growth target. And regardless of your fluctuations in the economy, you just keep that target. That way you're avoiding all of these political pitfalls. You're avoiding the crowding out that comes with fiscal policy. And they rely heavily on the quantity theory of money, which uses the equation MV equals PY. Sometimes you'll see it as MV equals PT. But basically, M is the money supply. V is the velocity of money. So velocity of money is how quickly money gets spent. And PY is your nominal GDP because P is your price level and Y is your output or your real GDP. So if you think of it that way, nominal GDP on the right-hand side of the equation, money supply times velocity of money on the left-hand side of the equation, you can see that this is really two sides to the same of the same transaction going on. So the amount of money multiplied by the amount of times it gets spent, multiplied by the prices times the amount of goods. So that's essentially why this works out. Now, for monetarists, they thought that the velocity of money was constant. That's the problem. They ignore those animal spirits that Keynes talked about. The idea that the velocity of money is not actually constant and is very much tied into our own irrationality. So, monetarism breaks down fairly quickly because of that velocity of money changing. So we also have the natural rate hypothesis come in as a challenge to Keynesian economics. And this says that as monetary policy, as you increase money supply, really all you're doing is resulting in higher inflation. So this is what we talked about with the Phillips curve, the idea that you're not causing growth with monetary policy. All you're doing is leading to inflation. So essentially the same thing that monetarists complain that that Keynesians would do, causing inflation, the same thing occurs with the monetarists, and it's just another way of proving those monetarists wrong. Another challenge to Keynesian economics, and this is one that very much holds up, is the political business cycle. And this is the idea that leading up to elections, a lot of politicians will advocate for expansionary fiscal policy because it makes them look better to their constituents. If they are able to bring something home to their home districts and say, look, I got the government to spend money on you all, then it looks better for them. Also, a better economy just generally looks better for the people in power. So, a lot of times you'll see expansionary fiscal policy in order to make politicians look better right before elections. And this really shows the need for central bank independence, because what you're seeing here is just sort of abuse of the system. So we then have neoclassical or new classical macroeconomics, and this is almost a rehash of the original classical. So they phrase it as there's rational expectations. In other words, individuals and firms are rational and they make informed decisions. And so if you take away those short-term gains and losses in employment and changes in inflation, it's all immediate. So you don't have to look at those. It's all immediate. So you try to change things out of long-run equilibrium, you cause inflation, and that's it. So don't try to do anything, because once again, it'll all shift back in the end. Neo-Keynesians or new Keynesians also come out of this. And they say some level of price stickiness exists. They do acknowledge correcting economy. They do acknowledge that Keynesianism can cause inflation, but they say, listen, there's still a real business cycle, and fluctuations in your factor productivity can cause this business cycle. You still have stickiness, you still have animal spirits, you still have these main issues. And so you need that upward sloping aggregate supply curve, not the vertical one advocated for by neoclassicalists. So you do need to consider the idea of aggregate demand playing a role in aggregate output. This all eventually leads us to the modern consensus, which you see summarized here. In the modern consensus, and I'll put this on the next slide as well, in the modern consensus, the idea is you use expansionary monetary policy in fighting recessions, except for real bad ones, and that's when you use fiscal policy. So it's effective, but really only use it in sort of a break the glass circumstance. Now, in terms of monetary policy used in a discretionary way, trying to stimulate growth through it, in dispute according to the modern consensus, but not generally thought of as good. So to define discretionary fiscal policy, that is government actions beyond your existing policies. So, trying to advocate for growth using fiscal policy, basically, is how we're looking at it in economics terms. And in reality, this should only be used in times of real trouble and liquidity traps. So to summarize the modern consensus, monetary policy is the main role in stabilization policy. That's what you do first. Break the glass for fiscal policy. You have an independent central bank. That way you avoid politics. You have discretionary fiscal policy used sparingly because you need to get stuff done, and sometimes you need to um, bring yourself out of recessions. Central banks should set targets for inflation and unemployment, especially inflation. Uh, Remember, expected inflation equals real inflation, and asset prices. We don't really know how to regulate asset prices. And in terms of unconventional monetary policies, well, sometimes stuff happens. And that was seen a lot in the crisis of 2008, and it's been seen more recently since the recessions caused by the pandemic. So really, this modern consensus kind of got blown up, and we're still trying to figure things out within the economics realm.